So I will come out and say right away that I was not raised religious. And the best understanding I got about the story of Jesus was from Jesus Christ Superstar. But that was mostly because my parents are hippies and my mom had a huge crush on Ted Neely in the role of Jesus. So this movie was definitely a little bit out of my comfort zone. And in order to kind of get context for it, I did have to do a little bit of research. And so part of this video will be uh, kind of supplemented by the research that I did. So hopefully everything will be mostly accurate. Um, if it's not accurate, I am open to kind and gentle feedback in the comments. But just kind of starting off with the understanding that this was different. It was a different experience for me. And so, with that out of the way, we will be talking about The Carpenter's Son, which was a recent release. It was written and directed by Lofty Nathan. It stars Noah Jupe, FKA Twigs, and Nicolas Cage. A remote village in Egypt explodes into spiritual warfare when a carpenter, his wife, and their son are targeted by supernatural forces. And so, if you haven't figured it out, this is a horror movie about an adolescent Jesus Christ. And this is where my research comes in. So just be just be warned that this was the result of a handful of Wikipedia pages. This story is based on something called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is what is known as an apocryphal gospel, meaning that it is sort of outside of the accepted canon for scripture. So it is not taken, I guess that what I interpreted that as meaning is that it is not taken as like biblical fact. And I did read that this was sort of considered a blasphemous text by some people. So that being said, this kind of creates a really interesting story to be released. I know that there were some issues, there was some controversy around it. I know that a lot of folks were review bombing this movie, calling for it to be banned. I believe the director also received a death threat in response to releasing it. So, really contentious as far as like religious stories go. And so part of the reason that this is a contentious movie and story is related to the central theme of the movie, which is to show Jesus as a very flawed and human character and show his struggle with determining what to do with these abilities that he's recognizing that he has. There is a character who embodies evil, and it shows him being sort of tempted by the evil side, very like almost like Star Wars in a sense, right? Like determining what side you're going to lean into. He's also defiant of his father. He's doing things he's not supposed to. He's doing things that are considered unclean, which is another theme I think really central to the story, this idea of like cleanliness and the opposite of cleanliness, right? You have these very biblical fixtures of like the lepers and the sort of like filth and rot associated with that, which comes into like one of my favorite details about this movie is the flies, which are absolutely unpaid actors. They should definitely have a credit at the end of the movie. There are so many flies in this movie, and that detail really kind of solidifies this idea of like the presence of uncleanliness and filth. So I will say before spoilers, when we're talking about execution, I do not believe that I am the target audience for this movie. I'm not entirely sure who is the target audience. I've never really thought about it before, but I'm not sure how many people in the religious community also watch horror movies. I'm sure there are plenty. It's something that I think could be sort of difficult, especially horror movies that focus on like demons and the more religious aspects. So I'm not sure if this movie is for religious horror viewers or if it's for maybe people who have shifted their religious beliefs throughout their lives. But it definitely didn't feel like something that was for like people raised non-religious because I had to, like I said, do sort of separate research in order to fully understand it. So if you were the target audience for this movie, please let me know and let me know a little bit of why that is. Another thing that sort of makes me believe that I am not the target audience for this movie is that I am also not someone who loves historical horror. But I will say, as far as I know, the setting and the props and the costuming felt very like accurate to the time, and it was very like minimal. There wasn't a lot going on with the setting. It was very like bare bones, kind of like straw huts, and generally just like in the middle of nowhere. The cinematography and the music were really competently done. Nothing that really blew me away, but was, like well matched with the rest of the movie. And as far as acting goes, I think Noah Jupe, Isla Johnston, and FKA Twigs were all very competent. They played their roles in a convincing way. I have a confession to make, no pun intended, and this might be a bit of a hot take, but I struggle with Nicolas Cage in really any role that he's done recently, but specifically in horror roles. I do think he's a good actor, but I don't think he blends into roles very well anymore. He has sort of defined himself very specifically in my mind. So anytime I see him in a role, he's just Nick Cage. I don't know if that makes sense, but I had a similar issue with Longlegs in that the character of Longlegs was sort of built up to be this like mysterious, frightening serial killer, but then as soon as he pops up, it's just Nick Cage. I know they tried to put a lot of prosthetics on him, but especially when he starts talking, it's just very, very clearly. My Letterboxd review for that movie was, I wish this was the first Nick Cage movie I'd ever seen. And that holds for this one too. I just can't separate him. And another thing was that he is the only person who doesn't have a British accent in this movie. So you have Mary and Jesus who have British accents, but then Nick Cage, who plays Joseph, doesn't. Also, I should clarify that the characters are not named these names. They have like kind of neutral, non-specific names. I think it's like the father, the mother, and the son. So it's not said explicitly, but we all know. But anyway, I will say another issue that I had just with the overall execution is that the plotting is kind of bland. I was very restless, maybe about 40 minutes into this movie, and I had almost contemplated leaving the theater, and I hate to say that because that doesn't happen very often, but it just dragged a little bit more than I was expecting, especially for how much controversy was around this movie. I thought it was going to be much like wilder and more intense and more insane, and it was just a little slow, I'll be completely honest. What I liked about the frights in this movie was that there was a good blend of supernatural and very human frights. I'll talk more specifically about that in spoilers, but it did sort of balance well for me in the movie. There were some interesting spooky visuals, nothing that was like very intense or compelling for me personally. I liked the overall theme of like the unclean, but I felt like, again, and what I'm gonna say is that it could have been grosser. They could have leaned into that and made it a bit more like viscerally nasty, especially with the lack of modern hygiene that was present in the setting in this movie. I think that we could have seen some like much more gross stuff. So Frights didn't really blow me away all that much either. And I will say that on IMDb, this is listed as a horror movie. So I know that sometimes thrillers will have a more dialed down visual nastiness, and I can accept that. But this is billed as a horror movie, so I want more horror. We will be getting into spoilers, so if you don't want to be spoiled on The Carpenter's Son, go check it out in theaters and then come back and tell me what you thought. So the entire movie can kind of be boiled down to Jesus, Mary, and Joseph arrive in this new town after fleeing persecution. They are living in secrecy, and as they kind of settle into this new life, Jesus is being tempted by a mysterious, non gendered little person who we come to find out later is Satan, and he is exploring his newfound abilities. He is struggling with like his sense of self, and ultimately in a final battle between him and Satan, he his goodness prevails, but Joseph is killed during this fight. And so at the end of the movie, him and his mother Mary walk off into the desert, and the rest of the fate is sort of unknown. And overall, right, like we know who this is, and we know, the eventual ending in the story. The part that's a mystery, or the part that we're not as familiar with, is this adolescent part. And it's it's an interesting concept in theory, but again in execution it's just a little bit slow and a little bit of a letdown. I will say that the final 15 minutes of the movie, sort of the climax, this battle between Jesus and Satan, is pretty visually compelling and pretty brutal, to be honest. So that was, I think, had that not been the last 15 minutes, that was like right before the end was when I was sort of contemplating leaving the theater. And so I'm glad I didn't, because it was a very compelling, like, final scene. I think my favorite part of this movie was the character design for Satan. Very non binary. Isla Johnston is very effective in this role, although some of the lines she's given are cheesy. But the character themselves is kind of has these very light scars all over her body. So it's like on her face and neck and arms. And they're these little like silvery scars. And it's not really explained what they are or why they're there, but it's just like an interesting detail that makes the character like a little bit more sinister. And I think overall, that was a very cool way to design the character. There's also a scene towards the end where she does a like a Baphomet hands, like the, I don't know what it is, like this and this. And that's neat. Like I think like kind of the calls to, what's going on are very interesting. I also think that like I said in earlier when I was talking about frights, there's like a balance of supernatural and very human horror. And so the human horror that I was referring to is there's a few scenes where Jesus goes to the place where people are being crucified or being punished for whatever crimes they committed. And that was very horrific. And I think leaning into that would have made this a bit more compelling to me, because it's just very like very gross and gritty and nasty to see. And I think it also is a very powerful image in the context of like the religious part of this movie. So that I think was interesting and well done. Overall, I think I'd give this one 3 stars out of 5. It, like I said, is not a movie that I am the central audience for, which is fine. I think that it had some major issues in terms of the plotting and the pacing, but it was visually interesting at points. It was very well acted. And yeah, I don't know. And I had trouble recommending this one. I had someone ask me if they thought that I would, that they should see it, and I I don't know. I couldn't really determine whether I'd recommend it or not. If the premise sounds interesting to you, definitely go see it and see what you think. I don't know. Yeah, it is an interesting one for sure. Let me know what your thoughts are on The Carpenter's Son, and if you were the target audience for this, and what makes you the target audience, because I'm still questioning still questioning who that would be for. So if you've stuck to the end of this video, I appreciate you. Feel free to drop a comment down below, like and subscribe. I also make content on TikTok, Instagram, and I write reviews on Letterboxd.